All right. Well, for the first time ever, the intro didn't quite wrap up. Anyway, I'm all thrown off now because this is Learning Tech Talks. Normally I say happy someday, but I don't know what day I'm going to be streaming this because I'm recording this on a Monday. I'm planning on going out for the birth of, or I'm not going to have the baby, but my wife's going to have the baby pretty soon. So I'm going to be streaming this pre-recorded. So I don't know what day this is right now or anything like that. But either way, it's Learning Tech Talks still Learning Tech Talks, where we're exploring the landscape of learning technology while cutting through the fluff. And today I am talking with Shannon Martin, and she's from Podbean. If you didn't catch from the clever pun of the title of this episode, we're going to be talking about podcasting, but podcasting on the enterprise side. Now we're going to share some best practices, dig into podcasting as a whole, but we're gonna kind of bring this because this is a newer area, I think, especially on the enterprise. So we'll get into that. Shannon, thanks for being here. But before we do, let's do a little bit of icebreaker stuff. So for you, Shannon, why don't you let everybody know where you are in the world today?
I am in Valencia, Spain, and it is sunny, beautiful, and hot here.
Sunny, beautiful, and hot. All right. Well, that is awesome. Is it, when does it start to cool down for the fall there? Is it similar to where I am here in the Midwest where you're getting there?
It probably will be beginning of October when it'll start to cool down. But we get a really nice breeze because we are on the ocean. So it's the evenings are cooler already.
All right. Well, and yeah, it's morning for me. It's almost end of day for you. So you're going to be able to, after this, probably get out and enjoy the weather. My days just start. It was a beautiful weekend here, but now today it's overcast, not necessarily the nicest. So I'm in the Waukesha, Milwaukee area here with my houseplant Fred, as always. But let's transition over to the other icebreaker question because I'm curious where you are with this one. A little bit of fun, and I've got an interesting response to this one. But what is one of the most recent movies that you enjoyed? And I told you, I'm not talking theater versus in-home. It doesn't matter. But I'm curious. Tell me a little bit about your movie style as well. So let's hear it, Shannon.
That's good that it's not theater because I think it's been a while since I've been to the theater, so I would have a hard time recalling. But I would say the one that pops to mind is Nomadland.
Nomadland. Okay. Yeah. What's that about?
It's really good. It has Frances. I can't think of her name. She's a really good actress. I'm horrible with actor and actresses' names, but Frances McDormand.
Frances McDormand. Yeah. Okay. Frances McDormand. Yeah. All right.
I think that's correct. But it is really about this kind of, and I think it's based on a true story, but it's not 100% about a person's life. But it's based on retirees, sort of retiree-aged people in the U.S. that are living in RVs because of a lot of economic factors and closing of factories and companies, and so kind of by necessity living in RVs and traveling around to different work opportunities. So going to the Walmart, during Christmas, working the warehouse and that kind of stuff. So but about the community around it and her experiences, and it's just a really well told story. Yeah, it was quite good.
What's interesting, so and from the sounds of it, that's a thing too. So I didn't realize that was even a thing. So interesting. All right. And when did you watch that?
It's probably been maybe a month or so ago. I've mostly been on watching shows.
Okay, all right. You're on a show kick right now.
more, yeah. Right. And I heard about the concept of what this movie was about on a podcast. Not about Nomadland, but there was and I can't for the life of me tell you which podcast it was, but it was. I listened to too many.
That's where you learned about it, and then you saw the movie, and it turns out that the movie was so good it made your top list of recent movies. I like it. All right. Well, so for me, my wife and we tend to be on show kicks as well, so it's harder for us to find movies. There's some ones that look interesting that are coming, but most recently, I'm big into animated movies. I watch animated movies with my kids. I mean, you have to. You have 5, soon to be 6 kids. You watch animated movies. And anyway, the new Paw Patrol movie just came out, and it's in theaters and Paramount Plus. Now, I haven't been to a theater in, good grief, I don't know how long. And that has nothing to do with the pandemic. Spending $150 on movies, just not really for me. But anyway, the Paw Patrol movie, Pretty solid movie. Really enjoyed it. And then we did a double feature. We watched Vivo on Netflix right after.
Huh?
Also an excellent movie. So I got to say, it was a good weekend. It was raining on Saturday, and that made up for it, to say the least.
Very
All
nice.
right.
A cozy family movie day.
Exactly. The only thing that was a bit disappointing is usually I make popcorn, and I went to make it, and I realized I was out. So everyone was extremely disappointed. But you know what? Captain Crunch is a great second alternative. So we just pivoted. How's that for agility? Okay.
Good to know.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Well, so let's transition over to the conversation at hand. We're talking about enterprise podcasting and things like that, but let's get to know you a little bit. I'm just curious. So you're at Podbean, but like, is your background, because you're the director of communications, is your background more communications and you got into podcasting? Or was it you were more into podcasting and then you got into a communications role at a podcasting company?
More the communications, got into podcasting,
Okay.
but I was a huge podcast fan. And I actually, I think it was around the same time probably that I started working with Podbean. Maybe it was a bit before. I think that I was running a chapter of Podcast Brunch Club, which is a group of people around the world, actually, but they have local chapters and a virtual now, where you basically do a book club for podcasts. You talk about a theme.
Really?
And you listen to some episodes. Yeah, so I was that kind of fan, like, you know, more than just a listener. And I did communications. I've always been sort of, you know, a writer, basically, but I do a lot of different pieces of communications. And when the Podbean opportunity came up, it was like, wow, by merging of my, you know, a role that's good for me and my true love.
That is so funny. Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's super cool. Well, and again, we'll get into it a little bit, but podcasting, people always say like, so is Learning Tech Talks a podcast? I'm like, well, I mean, yes, it is. And it does these, but I've learned as I've gotten into it, there's quite a community that really goes into the whole podcasting. Like you said, there's book clubs, people who create them. There's quite a community of people who get into that. They help each other out, share things. So it's been interesting. Okay. So you just paths intersected. Now let's talk about Podbean a little bit, because when it comes to, there may be folks, I think a lot of people have most people have probably heard a podcast or listened to one, whether they're super into it or not. Right. But then some of these different companies. So Podbean, what is Podbean specifically?
Podbean is primarily a podcast hosting company. So that means it's the place where people that do whether it's a personal podcast or business, which we'll get more into, that's the place where the media files are stored. And then we have a platform that allows the management and distribution of it, whether it's public distribution to all the podcast apps or whether it's internal distribution at a company. And there's a lot of other tools that go along with that, the management piece, but especially for the public podcasts, we have a lot of things related to monetization, so related to advertising and listener support and that kind of stuff. We also have an audio live streaming piece, and we have an app for listeners. So a lot of people know the name Podbean just because they'll say, oh, that's where I listen to my podcast. So they aren't even doing a podcast, but they know. And then our biggest area over the last maybe 4 years that we've grown a lot in is this enterprise piece. We probably were one of the pioneers in it, and it sort of happened because customers that were doing branded podcasts, companies said, but what about if I want to do one for my employees, and how would this work? And so we really developed it 100% based on customer need. And then we've been fortunate because we got into doing it fairly early, I would say, in the interest for companies to do it. So we were able to sort of iterate, change the platform as we saw what people needed. And so it's really fairly well developed. I think, we're not just getting into it. So yeah, that's a big piece of it right now.
So it started on the consumer side. That was really where the beginning, it got its foundation. And then as it grew, the need. And this is what we're going to talk about, because this is something even I personally have started to see, where internally at the enterprise, people start saying like, we should do a podcast here. And people don't realize what necessarily goes into all of that stuff. It's like, yeah, just go do it. And you're like, well, we can, but there's a fair amount of things to think about. And I think especially if you're a listener, you might just take that for granted because you just assume, well, I get notified and a new thing comes and I just listen to it. And you don't realize what goes into that to actually create it, distribute it, host it, manage it, analyze even the data in terms of listener stuff, things like that. Because I'm guessing you're in the analytics space then as well to help podcast hosts know who's listening to what, when, all that other good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Yep.
Okay. So I am curious, let's talk a little bit about this because we'll get into some of the workflow stuff, but actually I think it'd be helpful to lay that out because again, I think a lot of people may have listened to a podcast and maybe they've thought, hey, wouldn't it be fun to start one, whether that's personally or internally. We'll talk about the need there, but I'll chime in with kind of my perspective, just having done this, but let's actually talk through the workflow because I think that's helpful for people to understand if they haven't before. Because like we said, it can be easy to say, let's do a podcast without really thinking about what that takes. So let's talk about it from a creator standpoint.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that number one important thing, no matter if it's personal or corporate, is the planning and purpose behind it. And thinking about, like you said, it isn't uncommon for individuals to say, I think I'll start a podcast, or even companies to maybe say, hey, we should have this. I heard about this new thing, and someone's boss says, why don't we have one of those? But I think it's really important.
I just love that because that's kind of sometimes how the conversation goes, where it's like, this is a cool thing. Why don't we have that? We should have that.
Right. And I think that's fine, but it's important to think of why and how, in a corporate environment, for example, if it's internal, to think about what is the benefit to the employee, what is different about it than the other tools and platforms we use. Those are things to think about. If you're doing it personally, just to think about, what's already out there, what's different about it. It may just be your voice. I mean, there probably is a podcast on the subject matter, but what's your spin on it going to be? And from there, there's a lot of little steps like the logo, and that's again sort of true for corporate or personal, the title, some of these basics, and then the podcast hosting, which is somewhere that is going to take care of and make sure that your stuff gets out there to the people in a smooth way, because there's a lot of bandwidth involved with, the streaming and the downloading of them. And then, once someone's ready to hit the ground running, there's a million different ways to do it, because a lot of people, if they're doing solo episodes, they're recording and using editing software directly. But obviously, if you're doing something like what you're doing, where you're streaming or, and doing remote interviews, then you need some kind of tool. Some people repurpose Zoom calls. You can use StreamYard or a, streaming tool and repurpose that. There are very specific podcast recording tools. There's a couple of those. Yeah. So there's different ways to go about recording. And there's, literally people do interviews. People do solo sort of monologue shows. People do, when we're seeing internal stuff, we're seeing people take pieces of training, take nuggets of knowledge, have, weekly discussions, all kinds of topics like that.
Like discussion boards. Okay.
Yeah, so there's kind of every.
Well, it's funny as you bring up the purpose point of it, in that when you really think about it, that's true, I would say, of anything in learning and development, because if you just go into it and go, let's do a thing, and then we'll figure out whether the value's there or what, it's probably not going to go too well for you. But on podcasting, especially when you think about this isn't the type of thing where you create an episode or 3 episodes and then call it a day and go, good, see, now we have a podcast. And I think that goes back to that point of, you really have to think, hey, what really could be a central theme of a show that we can create a series of these things? Because otherwise, and this is something that I think people will probably get into, people are probably never going to discover it, and they're probably never going to listen to it because there's 1 or 2 things randomly thrown off, and they're not going to build that rapport of, oh, I'm excited, here's another one of these types of things, because they'll go, oh, one random thing that I can listen to, I'm not going to get into that.
Yeah, it doesn't build that habit. And we have a couple of several companies that have shared sort of their case study, since most of these are internal. I can't say here, listen to this one, but they've done interviews with us and they've talked about some of the things they've learned and sort of how they're using podcasts and stuff. And quite a few of them have said that. And the ones that we've talked to, I mean, they're really doing well with it. They've been very successful. They have great engagement. A lot of them have switched a lot of other mediums that they were using over to they're still using plenty of other ways of communicating and stuff, but they've switched a lot of things to podcasting because they've had such success. But they all say, you do have to be patient with it. You have to plan well. You have to promote, and you have to, plan, promote, and plan on having some patience, with it growing and building momentum. And that's where that habit. Certainly, we have a lot of people that do limited series and stuff, but then they're usually doing different kinds of podcasts. So they might have one that is just 5 episodes, but that they don't just do a 5-episode thing.
It's a mini series in hey, we have a strategy around podcasting, and this is the limited series for this type of a thing. But it can't be, I have this great idea. We're going to have a podcast. It's going to be 2 episodes, and that's the only thing we're ever going to do with it. And you go, well, I don't know that that's really going to go very well for you.
You're just not really building a habit. If that's the case, you're just recording a couple things on audio as opposed to a different way, and you just have them on your system or whatever. But it's not really, I mean, you can call it a podcast, but you're not going to get people in that. You're not going to get this.
And you're not going to get into the debate about whether it is or not, but let's be honest, it's not. It's not a podcast.
And the thing is, you can call it a podcast, but I would say the thing that is not going to happen is you're not going to get the benefits that we will probably delve into a little more that you would with something that is more podcast-like.
Yeah. Well, and what's funny, and actually that's where I want to go next. But I think one of the things that is valuable to highlight, and why I think it's a good thing for L&D to consider, but something to take into consideration if you're talking to other people. It's one thing if you're just doing it yourself, but if you're talking to other people, the whole hardware and software side of capturing the audio, it does matter. It does matter because you have to think with a podcast, this is just something in somebody's ear and they're just going to be listening to it. So if it sounds like you're in the bottom of a pool or next to a jet engine, it doesn't matter how interesting the topic is going to be. You're probably not going to get anybody who's going to be able to tolerate it for very long. So that whole, how do we make sure that you're, one, making it interesting from a content standpoint, but 2, also adding that. Now, the L&D professionals, I think it makes a difference because a lot of times we've got microphones and things like that because we're doing voiceovers and stuff. But you got to consider that from your guests and things like that as well. Is that reasonable? Is that a reasonable caution? Because I've heard some that like 2 seconds in, you're like, no way can I listen to this for 10 minutes? Yeah,
I think it's easy to do. And like you said, when I talk to L&D folks, it's usually, they don't really have questions about that usually. They usually are set. They want to know that they have the platform problems and questions.
Yeah, they have the platform. We got this thing.
But,
what do we do with it?
But they're pretty set, but definitely it's something to consider. But there's pretty easy tools. And then we have a couple production companies that we have as resources that if the CEO decides he or she wants to do a podcast that and everyone's like, we don't even know how to go about this, we want to make it good sound, and we want to all of this, we have resources that people can use if they don't have them internally. But we find most companies do have it. They just need to kind of figure out what those pieces are.
Okay. All right. So then let's talk about the problem set, because I can go in a million different directions with this, because I'd love your perspective with as many podcast things as you're involved with. But where does this? I mean, yes, we have the example where an executive might go, why don't we have a podcast? We should have a podcast. But realistically, that's one situation. But now this is moving into the enterprise. I would say what's interesting, if you talk to some people, they think podcasting's old. But if you talk to other people, it's relatively new compared to, say, blogging. Blogging started far before podcasting, and then podcasting started gaining its momentum. But what are some of these things that organizations are trying to solve for that they go, maybe we should consider podcasting? Have we done this before?
Yeah, I think that number one, it still is. You're right. It still is seen as sort of modern. For the employee perspective, is that it's like, oh, that's kind of cool. And it doesn't, it has an appeal to them that sometimes trying to tell them, we have this new meeting, we have this, and right now, I think I'll talk about mobility and stuff, but I also think just the fact that people have been more overloaded with extra meetings, more Zooms, more these kind of things. There's a certain level of fatigue with all of that, and the point of a podcast would be to not make it another thing, but to make it a better alternative for certain things,
okay.
And to be to make it's more flexible. And so I think a big part of what we've seen is that from the get-go, it was a lot of companies saying mobility is really important. It was a ton of sales teams when we first started. That's where the training,
they're on the road. They're not necessarily sitting at a desk where they can join a Zoom meeting.
They often need tools, techniques. They need to hear role plays. Sometimes they need to hear stories of how other salespeople are being successful. And then depending on the industry, but in almost any industry, there's a lot of constant information flow and updates. And again, you're on the road all day, or you're selling, no matter how you're doing it, you're focused on selling, but you have to also get these updates. And this is a way that, you can multitask, you can get it in, you can have it on demand. So you can always be getting this when you need it. And that's what we saw at first a lot. Now, of course, that has shifted to people realizing that's true in a lot of different roles. And then over the past year and a half or whatever, however long we've been in this
I have a sneaking suspicion you saw a bit of a spike over the last 18 months in podcasting.
We saw it was kind of just a shift in what people said when they contacted us. I think it's been increasing a lot anyway. Okay. But I think we saw this, that being a key factor where they were saying, not just because people were remotely working more and working from home, so more disconnected, but also because there's so much uncertainty. And of course, my belief is life is always uncertain, but it's been made abundantly clear. And so a lot of industries were going through a lot of flux, and to really keep people sort of more grounded and to really have a cohesive strategy and to be understanding what's happening, what's going on. Again, without just adding 5 more meetings to the day. Okay. It was a way that a lot of people knew they could communicate and do that. So the mobility and I would say the on-demand nature of it. And then the other piece we see is that story, as you said about the audio, it needs to be decent because that's all it is. That's also a distinct advantage to audio for a lot of learning and informational kind of things, I think, because even if you are taking a walk and listening, it's still very sort of focused into your brain. There's some research on it, but we're trying to sort of gather more as we work with companies to really, but I always tell people, if you think about your own personal podcast listening, or think back to old radio shows or whatever, it's something people always refer to it. I heard on a podcast, and they remember it because it's a story-driven thing.
It is, it's a different, and it's interesting. There's a company called Arist, and I got to know them back before they really, started growing. And I thought, what they had done is they had taken micro-learning to text messaging, which in some regards initially was perceived as a step back. Mm-hmm. And I remember seeing it going, this is actually really brilliant in terms of how you're reaching people in a different way that is meaningful. And you think about podcasting in a similar sense where, you're reaching people in a very different way that allows them, like you said, to focus, to consume, to be able to multitask while at the same time being zoned in. It's a weird, almost surreal. I just think of when I listen to a podcast, it is different. It's a different experience, but also the mobility of it it's huge. I think a lot of times people push video and go, video is, good grief. I can't tell you over the last few years how often conversations were video this, video that. And video is great, but video can also be very challenging to produce, but then also get to people, actually have them sit and watch a video for any period of time can be challenging type of a thing, because it requires you to sit and focus all your attention in a way that doesn't allow you to do other things.
Yeah, and I think with the load that is on a lot of people, more so, and people want that respect from their company that, we respect your time. We're not trying to waste your time. We're not trying to make you squeeze more in necessarily, but we're thinking of how it works for you, is an important factor. And then also, and video is important to use for certain things. We actually do have
sure.
video.
I'm not downplaying it that way either, but yeah.
But we actually have video podcasting on our platform, so it can be done. But there are so many things that people come to us and talk about what they want to make into a podcast. And they're saying, oh, we've recorded this thing in the past or whatever. And they've recorded sitting here yet. And they're saying it's really just people speaking. That's what it is. So actually this makes much more sense to make it more accessible in this format. And again, even if we're using it in multiple formats or whatever, but we're able to really, again, make it more accessible for everyone.
Okay. Well, and I would say that's where it's always fun and confusing when people ask me, what is Learning Tech Talks? Because it's a video podcast, but it's also a live stream, but it's also an audio podcast. And I think my perspective on that was bringing some of my personality to it, which is I'm just going to put it out there in all the different formats. And then however people end up wanting to consume it, so be it. You want to listen to it on demand kind of as you're going. And it's been interesting actually collecting some data from people, just qualitative, not, research study, but actually hearing how some people will go, I love watching it because I love seeing the interaction and this and that. Other people go, I listen to it, but then when I hear something that I go, ooh, I will go back and I will watch at that moment because I want to see, what was the dynamic of the conversation or what was that thing that they showed because it sounded really interesting type of a thing. So I think it's interesting in that it doesn't necessarily always have to be, and I think this is where technology has democratized this tremendously. It doesn't have to be, well, it's one or the other. It can be, technically you can do whatever you want with it. But if you go just straight audio, it can be a very low barrier to entry for people to say, look, if you're just doing audio, it's much easier to edit in terms of, hey, I need to chop some things out or clean it up or whatever. It doesn't require the time, even from a processing standpoint. And there's a lot of value to say audio makes it very accessible to people.
Yeah, and definitely it's on the consumption side and on the production side for sure. And a lot of the companies we're working with, they started with a specific, often, a training focus or one team needed something or someone thought it was a cool idea. And then a lot of them now have really democratized it to where, and we have this unlimited platform. So they can create as many channels as they want. And so it's nice because, hey, no harm, add more, test it out, see how it goes. But a lot of the teams are creating, which brings a whole new level of value to the knowledge sharing that's going on
for
in
user-generated content.
Yeah, and there's a lot, and it's quite interesting. And some of them don't have what you mentioned before about L&D folks, having experience with that. So then some of these companies, they're either just letting them start at kind of a minimal level and saying, well, you can use this tool we already have to record, but then usually if they do well with it and take off, I know one of our clients, that's what they do. They kind of say, okay, just have an interview on Zoom and record it, and you can kind of get this started, and let's talk about what your plan is with it. Okay. And then we'll get you. They have a pro subscription to an editing software, and they give them a mic, and so once they see that that this podcast is going to
once they see that it's not just like an idea that somebody woke up with and said, I'm going to do this, and then a week later it fizzles out.
Yeah, so they're really, they're generating all more content than they had before, sharing a lot of interesting, knowledge, a lot of subject matter knowledge that really was not getting shared that way before. And people have a comfort level with a quick recording for it. So it's, that's another real advantage to it.
Okay. Well, and I think, what's interesting on that one is I will say, video, going back to this whole video versus audio challenge, video, sometimes people are just less comfortable with it because of the video aspect. They're okay with talking. They don't mind talking, but the thought of being on camera makes them a bit uncomfortable. Where if it's we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to capture the audio for this. People tend and seem to be more comfortable with doing that. Going back to, I know a lot of companies right now, they're trying to do more around user-generated content, because to them they go, I mean, the knowledge is in the workforce. It's not in the crystal palace of corporate. It's actually out there. So how do we draw some of that out? And getting people to do video, similar to, we should have a podcast. I can't tell you how many times I've been in conversations where it was like, we should have people record videos of themselves sharing best practices, and then we'll share those with their enterprise. And that I've found is an extremely high barrier to entry, not only just from a technical standpoint, but getting people comfortable with video is much harder. And I had one that was where the idea started. And we actually said, what if we just had people create an audio clip of them sharing a best practice? And from an engagement and participation standpoint, the numbers skyrocketed because people had no problem grabbing their iPhone and doing an audio note of them sharing something and sending an MP3 or M4A versus set up a camera, record yourself, do this type of it. It was amazing to see the difference.
Yeah, and then like you said, with the editing of that, it's really easy to say you're going to make some clips and put them together and weave it together and have some music and those that's pretty easy. And not to insult any audio editors out there, it's work, but that's much easier than trying to piece that together in a video and figure out how you're going to put graphics with it and stuff. So it really there's so much of that out there that's completely untapped, I think.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer. You mentioned blogs earlier, and I keep saying this in different articles I've written and stuff, but I really think podcasts are as necessary for businesses as blogs or newsletters used to be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree on that end. So let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges or what can be best practices going into this, because we talked about, hey, you got to have a purpose, because if you just decide, hey, I'm going to record a podcast, but probably not going to end well for you, type of a thing. But then some of these other components, let's dig into so what are some of the things when maybe you're working with a client who says, hey, we want to do podcasting. What are some best practices or things that you've seen that you've said, this is really, in addition to knowing what you're trying to do, how do you see them bringing it to life, or what are some things along the way?
Yeah, a few different aspects of it. The planning is very important. The platform, which we can dig more into, but how you're going to deliver the content to the employees so that it does have a good user experience for them, along with all the things about planning the content. And I guess with doing the actual podcast, it's the content. How long does it need to be? What's the structure going to be? The audio, how are we going to have decent audio, and that kind of piece of it. So kind of, knowing the story behind it. And with an interview, maybe simpler, but you still know, okay, why am I going to interview this person? And am I going to have, you have a great flow that you've built over time where you kind of can go into a conversational piece, but certain questions you want to ask, you have your icebreakers. Yeah. I mean, those, and in what we're seeing is in internal podcasts that do well, they have some of those same elements that you or I would hear when we listen to our favorite podcasts. They create those icebreakers, or those, every time, we do employee stories, and every time we ask this question that becomes like a water cooler, topic and builds excitement. So I think knowing, some of those things that you like in podcasts and thinking of how to integrate those is important. And then, who's going to do what is, who's going to.
Because, there's operations and logistics. And I think sometimes that's not always considered. It's just like, yeah, we've got it. And then you go, right, and what are we doing with it? Not only to get the audio together, but how are we going to let people know about it? What are the channels? All this other stuff.
Yeah, and that I think is the other thing that you mentioned that I think is really important is the promotion bit of it. Okay. So not just assuming that we're going to say one time we have a podcast, or maybe we don't even say we have a podcast, and then we're like, why isn't our engagement doing, where's the engagement? No one's listening. So I think it's, we use this Podbean Pro app, or sometimes a white label app for our companies, and it has push notifications, all those things that help. And then we have embeddable players, but we also say, integrate, just like everything else, integrate it into your other communications. When you have user generated content and or employees being interviewed, different people, that really helps a lot with that. The excitement around it and building momentum. And also, just like any other sort of learning tool, knowing your purpose up front, but also knowing what's performing well and what's not, and asking, what's going wrong with this. We have this user engagement intelligence, which looks at second by second play data and stuff, and that's really important because if everyone's dropping off midway through,
30
then it's
seconds
probably hopefully that's a really bad sign. But
that's a really bad sign. Oh, they didn't even make it through the intro music.
Yeah. So, but there's a lot of times people will say, "How long should it be?" And there's different adages about as long as it needs to be and not a second longer. But the reality is, if people are dropping off at a certain point, and you're seeing that across the board, it should be shorter, or there's something in, you can see if they skip, with our analytics. So they might be skipping this section where you thought, oh, it'd be fun to do some different announcements in the middle, and you're realizing, let's put that in.
Everybody just skips past it anyway. It's just more of a barrier to people. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting about that, there's a million different directions we can go with this. I'm fascinated by some of this side of it, but is this what you just mentioned there? I think is true of not only podcasting, but I think a lot of times initiatives that we start in L&D, where you've got to know when it's time to take Yeller behind the shed and say, this isn't working, or this section's not working. We need to adapt or evolve because clearly it's not adding value. And if it's not adding value, even a podcast, you can go, oh, well, it's convenient. People are just listening anyway. Yeah, but if you're putting too many barriers in there that they go, man, this thing is filled with a bunch of stuff I don't listen to. I only like this 2-minute portion. They're not going to listen. So let me ask you this, though. Now I've got a bunch of follow-up questions based on what you just shared. But going back to the, what was it? You know what? I'll remember that part in a second. But the length piece, that was actually a really good point. And I'm curious if you see some best practices along that. While at the same time, I would agree with your nuance of not a second longer than it needs to be. Because I remember when I started learning Tech Talks, people said, it can't be more than 20 minutes. It has to be 20 minutes or 25. If it's more than that, no one will listen. And I'm like, I can't get through anything in 20 minutes related to learning technique. You're kidding. I'm not doing it. And so similar to you, I said, I'm going to let the conversation define the length. And that's how I ended up landing at the roughly hour long, because I go, that gives enough time to do it. And I remember people saying, oh, that'll never work. People will never listen to an hour long. And data says otherwise, when it's like, well, if the conversation or what's going on is adding value, people will listen to it. It's not a matter of pick this number and then back into a show.
Right. Yeah, I think that there are some best practices. I think that that's certainly true about the timing. And the good thing with a podcast is they can, and I do this all the time with podcasts, I listen as long as I'm taking my walk. And sometimes that's 2 to 3 podcasts to fill it up. Sometimes it's half of the podcast today, half of the podcast tomorrow, and then maybe rewind a little bit because I want to catch back up. So it can be very flexible, but it is important to not go on and on, when it doesn't need to be. And I say as someone who loves to go on and on, but I think that a lot of companies are trying to do it in sort of a typical employee commute time, whether employees are commuting right now or not. Okay. That's kind of been a way to sort of think about it, so that if they are commuting or if they're in sales and they tend to drive from client to client, it probably is a similar type of time frame. So they're trying to do it in those chunks. But we see people do what I call like micro learnings, very short bursts, or take a longer piece and break it into those. So there's different ways to do it. More digestible is better, and if there's a way to lean, I would say that's the way to lean. Okay. But as you're sharing, when it's something very relevant and chock full of information like what you're doing, then people will listen. So it's just a matter of kind of finding knowing which piece it is and where it fits. But
well, and I think goes back to the point of when you think about this as a more holistic strategy versus just a let's do this one thing, but to think about it as, hey, how might we actually be able to do this in different ways? Because to your point, there may be a really strong use case for, and I remember, I think I did kind of like a mini series. It was called Lind on Learning. And they were 5 minutes. It was like, here's a topic, here's a quick kind of summary of how to think about it or what you can do with it. Well, that's 5 minutes. Digging into enterprise technology and the capabilities and concerns and well, that's not 5 minutes. I can't do that in 5 minutes type of a thing. And so I think having the diversity to say, well, you know what we can do, let's let the topic and the goal drive the subject matter content and then go from there, I think is an important consideration on it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And again, I think because people can stop, pause, go back, and have it there at any time, that's part of the benefit of it overall. But that also allows for a little more flexibility with listening, because they aren't necessarily stuck listening to it if it is an hour and a half all at once. And they can kind of work it around their day and that. So
this is all I can handle. I'm going to hit pause and come back.
I've heard enough of your voice for today.
yeah, enough already. Well, and again, I think this comes back to, and we'll talk a little bit about this as well, some of the skills that goes into doing a podcast well, because you can have a very interesting topic be like nails on the chalkboard to try and listen to. But let me ask you this, though, from a timing standpoint, because we said about the importance of making sure you're marketing it, sharing, letting people know type of a thing. But then there's also this timing piece that I was thankful when I started learning Tech Talks. I had talked to a lot of people that had done these before. And one of their biggest pieces of advice was don't expect overnight to just get a ton of people engaging in it. It takes time for people it's a different kind of behavior for people when it comes to podcasting to say, okay, this is something, that either I have to discover, then I'm going to check it out, then maybe whether I come back, then I'm going to tell somebody. And so they said, don't expect numbers just to skyrocket out of the gate. And so going back to this, when do you pull the plug or when do you pivot? It's not something, and I'm curious what you're seeing on the client side, but my advice to people is don't think because, we launched this a week and a half ago and we haven't gotten the numbers we thought, you know what, this was a failure, I guess we're done.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're trying to do a few things to help with that. Is we recently did a thing where we have sort of an office hours where we have our podcast specialist available if someone, it may not be because there's a problem, but if they are experiencing something, we're trying to encourage them, let's not get 6 months, a year down the road and you say, we abandoned that because, and then we're like, we could have helped, with that issue.
That was a great suggestion, a great plan. You just, we would have tweaked it this way.
Yeah, we could. So we're doing that. We have a LinkedIn group, and it's for not just our customers, but anybody that's either doing podcasts or considering it. And the idea, with groups, it's slow to grow. But the idea of it in the long term is that, you could go on there and say, hey, we launched this podcast a week ago, and so far we've had one listen. What are we doing wrong? And people could either, could say, well, you maybe need longer than a week, but here's some ideas, and people could share those. So we're really trying to build that forum. I think that we have a fair few clients that do pilot programs with us. So for our platform, we can handle an enterprise of any size. But let's say someone comes to us and they have 100,000 employees. And so that requires a certain amount of seats, basically user seats with our platform. And so that's a lot up front to dive right into if you're not sure.
Right, out of the gate to try and do the enterprise.
So we'll say, okay, why don't we do a pilot project with it? You can release it, see how it's going. And then what we do find is that most people, if they let it go past a week, and if they've planned well and stuff, they tend to have more success than they expected. So it really grows from there. So we like people to dig into it and again, kind of plan for it and also really look at the analytics and see what is and is not working. Again, before they're just ready to abandon it. Do that sooner than later. If things are not quite living, even if things are living or exceeding expectation, what are you actually seeing with with the listening patterns and that kind of stuff.
Okay. Got it. Well, yeah. And I think, they're all really important considerations, and goes back to what we talked about in the very beginning, which is to be thoughtful and intentional about this. You can't, I've seen these go south before, where people have this great, and again, this is on a personal and professional side, where they go, yeah, we should do a podcast, let's just jump on and we'll start talking. And it's, it doesn't usually go very well.
Yeah, not many people are great at doing that without any kind of, especially without really the purpose behind it. And I think one of our clients, they've really had a lot of success, and a lot of their stuff is sort of employee story driven. And they do a little, it's not a ton of work, but it's less work than a lot of highly produced kind of things. But when they get sort of leads on some story to feature, this employee success story, this situation, this knowledge they want to share. And then they sort of vet it, decide, is that a good fit? And then they do a prep, call with that person. And it's short. I mean, I don't, and it's the kind of stuff about the tech a little bit, but more here's kind of what to expect. And, just kind of making sure that it's going to be something that goes well for everybody. And just that little extra bit of prep, makes all the difference in how it turns out, and actually reduces the need to edit and a lot of things like that. So it's that little bit of work can save a lot of work in the long run.
Okay. Well, and I was going to say, so for me, just sharing kind of what you just described is exactly, because I do some internal enterprise ones, and I do learning tech talks. And similarly, like you said, I have a bit of a prep, 15, 20 minutes where it's just like, hey, this is how it works. Here's the general thing. Here's a general flow of conversation. Here's the different components. And then sometimes I even do that as part of the recording. On the enterprise one, sometimes it's the first time people have sat down with me, and we just join, and I say, all right, let's talk through this. Anything, concerns you have, let's work through it. And then we just go from there. So it actually can be pretty straightforward. But I think your point of, well, let me ask you this, because you said employee stories tend to be a really powerful one, which I think storytelling is a key component to this, to being able to tell some sort of story or narrative and be able to carry that through. But I'm curious on this side, have you seen, because I've heard some podcasts that they're very formal. I ask a question, I wait for a response. I ask a question, I wait for a response, or things like that. Others are much more organic. Have you seen one that works better than others, or does it really depend on the subject matter and the topic?
The formal can be okay. Where we see the formal is more when people are maybe they actually are multi-purposing something. So it's much more of a two people on a stage or a panel or something, and they're having maybe a live event and they're recording it, and they're so that becomes more formal by nature.
And then they push it out as a podcast afterwards.
Yeah, and it works great to get it out to more people. But for a podcast that really is an employee story or an interview kind of thing, I think a conversational element is usually, if you think about the podcast you listen to and like, they have that. You feel, there's a funny meme about podcasts. It's a billboard. And have you seen this? And it's a person sitting there eating ice cream. Like, this is like listening to podcasts. Like, you think they're your friends. It's a billboard, the podcast hosts are the billboard, and you're the listener here going like, oh, this is, we're friends. And there is a sense, and that's the beauty, I think, of podcasting. You've seen it, from personal and professional standpoint, but I think it brings that to the company in a way that a written piece doesn't bring a voice. And it, especially when we're seeing leadership do them or be part of the interviews or something, then people are saying it really does personalize the company strategy and what the thinking behind some of this stuff is. So I think a conversational element, and you hit the nail on the head with storytelling. I think it's all about a story.
Okay. Well, and that's been now I did the more informal approach because there's nothing formal about me at all. So if I had tried to do it, in fact, I used to have a LinkedIn picture that was me in a suit. And I actually had someone I know well reach out and go, you got to change that headshot. It doesn't fit you. It just doesn't fit at all. So had I had some formal scripted podcast, people would have said, nah. And I would have had a hard time hosting it. But I was curious if you see what actually does connect better. And it's funny, being a creator is one thing, but I even think of, I have some podcasts that I listen to on a regular basis. And that feeling of, I feel like we're friends. Like I know this person type of a thing. I remember I ended up reaching out and setting up time to talk with one of the hosts. He and his wife have this conversation on their podcast, and the two of them, even though it's the two of them, they're just dialoguing back and forth. And I remember setting up time with them, and it was like, oh my goodness, it's so good, and they're kind of like, yeah, I mean, that's great. You listen to it so much. We ended up having a great conversation, but it is funny how you start to build this connection with your community like that, because they do feel like they're sitting and having a conversation with you.
Yeah. And I think right now, especially, we all know talent attraction and talent retention is like at an all-time peak, I think, in challenge. And, the need to really be focused on that is there, to have people have the development tools, the learning tools, but also to feel an affinity with a company, because they're going to go elsewhere if not. And it's not that easy to replace good talent nowadays. So I think a podcast can go a long way in that, especially with some of these leadership things, and just also hearing other employees' stories and successes. And we do see some more formal sort of scripted things for more of the training aspect, role plays being a big one. But actually they kind of come across conversational because that's kind of what they're supposed to be.
Right.
But yeah, we see those for those kind of things. But I think for interviews or stories and stuff, definitely adding those elements.
So I want to transition to one other piece here for sure, and we'll see how much time we have, because I told you we were going to run it. It goes quick, but because this is, I think, one of the pieces that's important to talk about, with probably why Podbean went into the enterprise, and for good reason, is I have been in many organizations where they've suggested we should do a podcast, we should have a podcast, and it gets started. And honestly, even just the hosting and distribution internally is a nightmare. I mean, it's legitimately can be a nightmare, where people go, well, where do I put? Oh, just put it on SharePoint. We'll just create a folder on SharePoint and we'll just drop the audio files in. And from a user experience standpoint, that's one of the things where, well, will that work? I mean, it'll work, but it doesn't work very well. And it's hard to get people to go back. And again, going back to the point you made earlier, where listening to podcasts, it's a very behavior habit driven type thing. And if people are having to navigate out to an intranet page and remember to do this and that, and it's not storing it on your phone so you can listen to it, it can be a real nightmare to do this. So I'm curious, how does the Podbean Enterprise piece work to help streamline that? Because I've seen great ideas for podcasts go right down the tubes, because we can't figure out what to do with it.
Yeah, that's definitely why we got into doing it. And it's been a huge part of how we've developed the platform over time. So you upload your podcast to our platform. For anything internal, specifically on our enterprise platform, we have a very high level of security. So there are some ways out there that you could make a private RSS feed, for example, with different hosting, or even yourself. But most of the companies we're working with, that's not going to pass muster for what their IT folks require, because that information can easily get out there. And if they're sharing anything at all that's they don't want to share with their competitors, and sometimes even things you think wouldn't be a big deal, it can be a big deal. So our stuff is all secure. It requires the users to log in and be approved as a private member. And in almost all cases, that's actually done through the company's SSO. So it's completely using the normal procedures that and the security that the company's already decided on, which makes it, number one, really easy on the employee. No new passwords, no creating accounts, and it also makes the security folks happy. So
yeah, especially because internal podcasts, like, they can get into things that you wouldn't necessarily, because I've had that where people said, man, this is a nightmare to host and manage internally. And so they'll look to external ones. Well, we'll put it on iTunes, or we'll put it on. And it's like, well, some of these conversations, your IT security team or even just business leaders would not want out available for public consumption. Sometimes it's not a big deal, but sometimes, in many cases, it's like, oh, no, 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 no.
Yeah. And the thing is that, so what we see is what you're saying, is the default then becomes, well, we don't want to deal with that. We don't think there's going to be something out there that's going to meet our needs. So we'll just do it with some kind of workaround solution that's not meant for podcasting. So that's what's happening. Okay. I would say a lot of companies out there, they'll say to me, oh yeah, we do a podcast. What they'll discover is they have engagement issues because it doesn't have the habit of podcasting. It doesn't have the user experience. So with our platform, they can embed players, onto their intranet in different formats. They can integrate it into whatever they have. But the employee can also listen online, logged in on a laptop if they want to, or that we have a mobile app called Podbean Pro. Podbean, we have a regular Podbean app. And so this basically borrows all of the things we've learned from many, many years of running a podcast app. So that's our huge advantage, is we already know what people like in terms of listening features. And we translated that into this professional app where when they hit it, they have to log in, they only get your content. They can actually they can pull in public content. So if a company says—
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, so they can do let's say we have 3 internal podcasts. So when I hit my Podbean page in the Pro app, I have those 3, but also Podbean's like, hey, TED Talks, that would really help you from a personal development perspective. So if it's a public RSS feed, they can sort of make a curated list of content also. Okay. So that's a nice feature of it. Some companies we do a full white label app for, but the Podbean Pro solution, we made that because a lot of people wanted something instantaneous to use that doesn't require a lot of the development stuff. And it's still their company logo when the person, once the person logs in. It's a Podbean Pro thing initially to get from the store, but then it goes straight to their— Yeah, and then it's like you would expect a podcast app to be. It has the pausing and the forwarding and the speeding up and all those different pieces. We have a comments option, so there can actually be some interaction. We have playlists. Playlists have been really big and something we added, I'm sure, not that long ago, in terms of being able to, like, if I'm the company admin, I can say, okay, we have 10 different company podcasts, and from each of them there's certain episodes that, so when someone comes on as a new hire, they need to have this playlist to really hit the ground running. And that's been really popular. And we have one company that says, like, revolutionize their onboarding. So it's pretty cool. Okay. Yeah.
Cool. Well, and like I said, I think that's an important piece to consider. Why, because again, it's like I've just seen these not go well because you got to think about the user experience, and it really does make a difference in terms of how you do that. And a lot of technologies, and this goes back to, it's not a competition. This is what I'm big on, the ecosystem concept, where it's not a dump your LMS, get Podbean Pro. It's like, no, they work together based on what you're trying to accomplish, because you have to think about the user experience. And I've heard, I get into debates on this because people say, oh, we need to consolidate everything into one. And I say, are you kidding? If you told me I could only have one app on my phone, I would go bananas. I wouldn't want one app that did everything. I'd want to know I use this app for this, I use this app for that. And that's where having a podcasting app is helpful, because you go, well, I go there to listen to my podcasts instead of I've got to go, to this one, then I got to dig into it. I got to figure out where they're at. It's not really a good user experience. You know what? I'm just not even going to do it.
Definitely. I definitely see that. And I think that, we'll have the push notifications like you're used to. So it's there. It's just making it really easy. Feeling. Yeah. And just making it really easy on employees, because you're right. I mean, digging around, expecting someone to dig around to find it within a larger thing is definitely, and yeah, we don't we aren't an LMS, we aren't a full intranet or anything like that. So we're simply this one piece of it that can be integrated. And we've done some cool things. Like we have one client who they do some sort of general communications kind of podcast, but they started out with really core training kind of stuff for their sales team. And so we did a quick integration with our API where, because they're doing learning credits for people's completion rates. So it kind of does a data dump every day and makes it really easy for them. So we're very lucky. We have a development team that's really good if we need to create some new developments.
All right. Well, you know what, Shannon, as always, am out of time before I run out of things to talk about, because we only scratch the surface as far as I'm concerned as it relates to podcasting and enterprise podcasting even. But this has been really helpful. I hope everybody who has listened to it has had a chance just to think differently about what you might be able to do and how, if pure audio podcast approach to content or development isn't part of your strategy, it's, from my perspective, absolutely something you should be considering as an additional channel for people to be able to get content in a new and different way that reaches them. So I appreciate you being here, making the time. Always enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you have a wonderful week.
Thank you. Yeah, glad to be here.